The autumn wind whispered through the maple trees as David walked the familiar path to his son's grave. The groundskeeper nodded at him from across the way. After 3 years of weekly visits, most of the cemetery staff knew him by sight. David clutched a small model airplane in his right hand, its blue paint chipped at the edges from being handled so often. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the headstones. David had timed his visit perfectly, as he always did. He preferred the cemetery when it was nearly empty, when he could talk to Alex without feeling self-conscious about other mourners overhearing his one-sided conversations. "Hey, buddy," David said softly as he reached the simple granite marker. He crouched down, his knees creaking in protest. At 46, he sometimes felt decades older, the weight of grief aging him beyond his years. He placed the model airplane carefully against the headstone. It was a replica of a Cessna 172, the first plane Alex had ever flown during his introductory flight lesson on his 16th birthday. The memory of his son's face that day lit up with pure joy as they drove. Home from the airfield was one David revisited often. "Your mom called yesterday," David continued, brushing some fallen leaves away from the base of the stone. "She's doing better. Started teaching piano lessons again." He paused, his throat tightening. "We both miss you. Every day." The divorce had come 10 months after the accident. Neither he nor Beth could bear the constant reminder of their loss that they saw in each other's eyes. The split had been amicable but necessary, a desperate attempt to survive their shared pain separately when they couldn't seem to do it together. David sat fully on the ground now, not caring about the damp earth soaking through his jeans. This was his ritual. He would talk for a while, then sit in silence, then walk the long way back to his car. The rhythm of these Sunday visits structured his week in a way that kept him functioning. "Work's been busy," he continued. "The kids at school are getting ready for college applications. Makes me think about what you'd be doing now. Second year of college, probably. Still set on becoming a commercial pilot, I bet." His voice caught. "The Henderson's boy got accepted to that flight school you were researching, the one in Colorado." Crow cawed overhead, making David look up. The sky was turning a deeper blue as the sun began its final descent. He should be heading back soon. His small rental house would be cold and empty, but he had papers to grade and lesson plans to prepare for his high school English classes tomorrow. "I should get going," David said, struggling to his feet. He touched the top of the headstone, a final goodbye gesture. "I'll see you next week, Alex." He was halfway across the row of graves when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it under the rustle of leaves. David froze, listening intently. There it came again, a soft whimpering noise like nothing he'd heard in the cemetery before. His first thought was that an animal might be injured somewhere nearby, perhaps a rabbit caught by a hawk or a wounded squirrel. The sound came again, pulling him back toward Alex's grave. David followed his ears, scanning the ground around the neighboring plots. The sound grew slightly louder as he approached a large oak tree just beyond his son's headstone. He peered around the massive trunk, expecting to find some small creature in distress. What he saw instead made his heart stutter in his chest. Tucked against the base of the tree, partially hidden by a carpet of fallen leaves, was a small bundle wrapped in what looked like a pale blue blanket. The whimpering sound came from within it, growing more insistent now as if sensing human presence nearby. "Hello?" David called out, looking around wildly. The cemetery was deserted now. Even the groundskeeper had disappeared. "Is anyone here?" His voice echoed against the silent stones. Cautiously, he knelt beside the bundle. With trembling fingers, he pulled back a corner of the blanket. A tiny face peered up at him, red and scrunched with distress, impossibly small and perfect. A baby. A newborn baby from the looks of it, with wispy dark hair plastered to its head. "Oh my God," David whispered, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Oh my God." The baby's cries grew stronger, tiny fists waving in the air. David glanced around again, half expecting, hoping, to see someone running toward them. claiming this was all a misunderstanding. But the cemetery remained empty and silent except for the increasingly urgent cries of the infant. With unsteady hands, David carefully picked up the bundle. The baby was swaddled tightly, professionally almost, and felt surprisingly light in his arms. As he adjusted his hold, something fluttered to the ground, a folded piece of paper that had been tucked into the blanket. Balancing the baby in one arm, David retrieved the note and awkwardly unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, but legible. Please, give him what I cannot. His name is Thomas. Nothing more. No explanation, no identifying information, nothing to indicate why this baby had been left here of all places, near his son's grave. The baby, Thomas, had quieted somewhat in David's arms, his cries softening to hiccuping whimpers. David bounced gently, a movement that came back to him from 17 years ago when Alex was an infant. It's okay, he murmured, though nothing about the situation was okay. It's okay, Thomas. The name felt strange on his tongue. This child had a name. Someone had named him, cared enough to give him that at least before abandoning him in a cemetery at dusk. David's mind raced through the proper procedures. He needed to call the police immediately. This was abandonment, possibly criminal. The baby needed to be checked by medical professionals. There were protocols for this sort of thing, systems in place. Yet he remained rooted to the spot, staring down at the tiny face that was slowly relaxing as the crying subsided. Something about the baby's eyes, now blinking open to reveal a startling blue color, made David's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. What happened to you, little guy? He whispered. Where's your mom? As if in response, Thomas made a small gurgling sound and turned his face toward David's chest, seeking warmth or comfort or both. The simple, instinctive movement broke something loose inside David. 3 years of carefully controlled grief suddenly threatened to overwhelm him. A brisk evening breeze swept through the cemetery, making the baby shiver despite the blanket. That practical concern finally spurred David into action. Whatever the circumstances, he couldn't stand here deliberating while a newborn got colder by the minute. With one last glance at Alex's grave, as if seeking guidance or permission, David tucked the note into his pocket and began walking quickly toward the cemetery entrance, cradling Thomas close to his body to shield him from the wind. His car was parked just outside the gates. David fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. The baby started crying again, louder now, clearly hungry or uncomfortable or both. Shh, it's all right, David said, though he knew it wasn't. We're going to figure this out. He managed to unlock the car and stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the sudden realization that he had no car seat, no safe way to transport an infant. The hospital was only 10 minutes away, but driving with the baby unsecured was unthinkable. David made a split-second decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Emergency services. What's your situation? The dispatcher's calm voice came through the speaker. David's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. I found an abandoned baby at Oak Ridge Cemetery, a newborn. I'm still here, at the main entrance. The baby seems okay, but I don't have any way to safely transport him. The dispatcher's professional tone never wavered. Sir, I'm dispatching police and an ambulance to your location now. Can you stay on the line? Yes, David said, looking down at Thomas, who had settled again. Eyes closed, face peaceful in a moment of contentment that David knew wouldn't last long. Yes, I'll stay right here. As he waited for the sirens that would soon shatter the evening, quiet, David couldn't shake the feeling that something profoundly strange and significant had just happened. Of all the graves in this sprawling cemetery, why had this baby been left near Alex's? Was it random chance? Or something more? The fading sunlight caught the edge of the model airplane still resting against his son's headstone in the distance. For the first time in 3 years, David felt something stir inside him that wasn't grief. He didn't have a name for it yet. It wasn't as simple as hope or purpose. But it was something alive and urgent, something that demanded his attention, in a way nothing had since the accident. Thomas sighed in his sleep, a tiny sound that somehow filled the growing darkness around them. David tightened his hold, making sure the blanket covered the baby completely. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I've got you." And he did. The police cruiser's red and blue lights bounced off the cemetery gates, casting strange shadows across the headstones. David stood awkwardly by his car, still holding baby Thomas, who had fallen into an uneasy sleep. Two officers approached, a middle-aged woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and a younger man whose uniform looked freshly pressed. "Sir? I'm Officer Chen. This is Officer Taylor," the woman said, her eyes immediately going to the bundle in David's arms. "Is this the baby you reported?" David nodded, suddenly feeling tongue-tied. Now that help had arrived, the reality of the situation was sinking in. "Yes, I found him over there." He gestured toward the area near Alex's grave. "He was just left there, with this note." He shifted Thomas carefully to pull the folded paper from his pocket. Officer Chen read it quickly and exchanged a glance with her partner. "How long ago did you find him?" "About 20 minutes ago. I was visiting my son's grave. I come every Sunday and I heard crying." David looked down at Thomas's sleeping face. Nobody else was around. I looked. I called out, but there was no one. "The ambulance should be here any minute," Officer Taylor said, his voice gentle as he studied David's face. "We'll need to take a statement from you, sir." As if on cue, the wail of an approaching siren cut through the evening air. Thomas stirred at the sound, his tiny face scrunching up before relaxing again. David found himself rocking slightly, an instinctive movement to keep the baby calm. "What's going to happen to him?" he asked. Officer Chen's expression softened slightly. "He'll be taken to Memorial Hospital to be checked out. Then Child Protective Services will get involved. Standard procedure for abandoned infants." David had worked with CPS before in his role as a high school English teacher. He knew the system was overloaded, understaffed, and despite everyone's best efforts, often painfully slow to respond. The thought of tiny Thomas entering that system made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. The ambulance pulled up beside the police cruiser. Two paramedics jumped out, moving with the efficient haste of people used to emergencies. They approached with a small medical kit and what looked like a portable incubator. "Evening, officers," the older paramedic greeted them before turning to David. "Sir, can you tell us what you know about the infant? Any signs of distress, unusual, breathing, anything concerning?" David shook his head. "He's been crying on and off, but otherwise seems, I don't know, normal. I don't know much about babies. He feels warm enough. He's been moving his arms and legs." The paramedics nodded, and the younger one, a woman with kind eyes, held out her arms. "May I? We need to do a quick assessment." Reluctantly, David handed Thomas over. He hadn't realized how tense his arms had become from holding the baby so carefully, afraid of making any wrong move. As the paramedic placed Thomas on a blanket spread over the ambulance's gurney, David felt strangely empty-handed. "He looks to be only a few days old," the paramedic said, gently unwrapping the blanket to examine Thomas more thoroughly. The baby started crying immediately at the exposure to the cool air. "Good lung function. That's positive. We'll get him warmed up and to the hospital for a proper checkup." Officer Chen touched David's elbow. "Sir, we need to take your statement now. Can you walk us through exactly what happened?" For the next 15 minutes, David recounted his discovery while the officers took notes. They asked for his ID, his address, his phone number. They wanted to know if he'd seen anyone suspicious in the cemetery, if he'd noticed any vehicles parked nearby. David answered mechanically, his attention split between their questions and the paramedics working with Thomas just a few feet away. "Will you need me to come to the station?" he asked finally. Officer Taylor shook his head. "Not tonight. We'll be in touch if we need anything else. We'll be conducting a search of the cemetery and surrounding areas, checking for any witnesses or cameras that might have caught something." The female paramedic approached them. "We're ready to transport the baby to Memorial. He seems stable, good color, strong heartbeat, normal respiration." No obvious signs of distress or neglect, but the doctors will do a full workup. David nodded, relief washing over him. That's good. That's really good. She hesitated, then added, You did the right thing, keeping him warm and calling right away. Some abandoned newborns aren't found so quickly. The words were meant to be comforting, but they sent a chill through David. What if he hadn't visited Alex's grave today? What if he'd come earlier before Thomas was left there, or decided to skip this week? The thought of that tiny baby alone in the darkening cemetery, temperatures dropping with the night, was unbearable. Can I? David started, then stopped, unsure what he was even asking. Is it okay if I come to the hospital, just to make sure he's all right? The officers exchanged another look, but it was the paramedic who answered. That would be fine. You can follow the ambulance if you'd like. She gave him a small smile. It's not uncommon for the person who finds an abandoned baby to feel a connection. Some people like to know how things turn out. Connection. Yes, that was it. Though it felt like too mild a word for the strange pull David felt toward Thomas. It wasn't just concern for a helpless infant. It was something more specific, more personal. Something about finding this baby near Alex's grave had cracked open a part of his heart he'd thought was permanently sealed. I'll follow you, David said decisively. 20 minutes later, he sat in the waiting room of Memorial Hospital's pediatric emergency department. The bright fluorescent lights made his eyes ache after the dim evening at the cemetery. A clock on. The wall showed it was just past 8 p.m. Around him, other worried-looking adults waited with children of various ages, most obviously ill or injured. David felt out of place, neither a parent nor a relative of any patient. A social worker had met. The ambulance upon arrival, she'd spoken briefly with David after conferring with the paramedics, thanking him for his actions and taking down his information again. Then Thomas had been whisked away through double doors, leaving David unsure of his next move. He should go home. There were lesson plans to finish for tomorrow's classes, a stack of sophomore essays to grade. He had no legal connection to Thomas, no right to medical updates, no role to play in what happened next. Yet he remained seated, staring, at the doors where the baby had disappeared. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Beth, his ex-wife. Did you visit Alex today? It read. Even after their divorce, she kept track of his Sunday visits, sometimes asking if he'd tell Alex something from her, or leave flowers on her behalf. David hesitated, thumbs hovering over the screen. How could he possibly explain what had happened? It sounded bizarre even to him, and he'd lived through it. He settled for simplicity. Yes. Something strange happened. I found an abandoned newborn near his grave. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, are you serious? Are you okay? I'm at Memorial Hospital. Baby's being checked out. I'm fine, just shaken. Do you want me to come? David stared at the message. Beth lived on the other side of town now with her sister. They were on good terms. Their divorce had been about mutual survival, not anger. But they rarely saw each other outside of occasional coffee meetings to discuss shared financial matters or memories of Alex. Before he could decide how to respond, a doctor in light blue scrubs approached him. Mr. Mercer, I'm Dr. Wilson. I understand you're the one who found baby Thomas. David stood quickly, shoving his phone back into his pocket. Yes. How is he? Dr. Wilson's expression was professionally neutral. He's doing well, all things considered. We estimate he's between 2 and 3 days old. He's slightly dehydrated, but otherwise in good health. No signs of birth complications or neglect. Someone was taking care of this baby before he was left at the cemetery. Relief flooded through David. That's good news. Yes, it is. We've notified. Child Protective Services, of course. A social worker is already making arrangements for emergency foster placement. Dr. Wilson paused. These cases are always difficult, but I wanted to let you know that his prognosis is excellent. Physically speaking. David nodded, processing this information. When will he leave the hospital? Probably tomorrow, assuming all his tests come back normal. We'll keep him overnight for observation and to make sure he's feeding well. And then he goes into foster care? Yes, while authorities try to locate his mother or other family members. Dr. Wilson's expression softened slightly. You seem very concerned about him. David ran a hand through his hair, suddenly aware of how strange his interest might appear. I just want to make sure he's okay. Finding him like that, it affected me. Dr. Wilson nodded understandingly. That's natural. Listen, I can't make any promises, but if you'd like to see him once more before you go, I might be able to arrange that. Some studies suggest that abandoned babies benefit from consistency in the faces they see in their first days. I'd appreciate that, David said, surprised by the intensity of his relief at the offer. As he followed Dr. Wilson through the double doors toward the pediatric unit, David's phone buzzed again. He glanced down to see Beth's response. I'm on my way. Nobody should go through something like this alone. Something warm and unexpected unfurled in David's chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. For the first time in 3 years, he felt the rigid patterns of his grief-structured life beginning to shift, making space for something new. David stood at the viewing window of the hospital nursery, watching as a nurse tended to Thomas. The baby looked impossibly small in the clear plastic bassinet, wrapped in a standard-issue hospital blanket. A tiny card taped to the front read simply, Baby Thomas, Dob unknown. He's beautiful, Beth said softly, standing beside David. She'd arrived at the hospital 30 minutes ago, slightly breathless and full of questions. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the newborn who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. Yeah, David agreed. He is. The nurse noticed them watching and gave a small wave. She finished checking Thomas's vital signs, then picked him up and approached the window. Would you like to hold him? She asked through the glass. David hesitated, looking at Beth, who nodded encouragingly. Go ahead, she said. I'll wait here. He followed the nurse into a small side room equipped with a rocking chair and changing table. The walls were painted a pale yellow, cheerful but soothing. Sit down, the nurse instructed, waiting for David to settle into the rocking chair before carefully transferring Thomas into his arms. Support his head just like that, perfect. Thomas squirmed slightly, then settled against David's chest. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady. He weighed almost nothing, yet David felt the responsibility of holding him like a physical pressure. He's been fed and changed, so he should be content for a while, the nurse said. The doctor said you found him? David nodded, unable to take his eyes off Thomas's face. At the cemetery, near my son's grave. The nurse's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry about your son. It's been 3 years, David said automatically, the response he always gave when people expressed condolences, as if the passage of time should somehow lessen the loss. I lost my brother 5 years ago, the nurse said quietly. Some days it feels like yesterday. She patted David's shoulder. I'll give you some time with the little one. Just press that button if you need anything. After she left, David sat, in silence, listening to Thomas's soft breathing. The rhythmic sound was hypnotic, pulling him into a strange, calm space where time seemed suspended. He thought about Alex, about how he'd felt holding him for the first time 17 years ago, filled with terror and wonder and love so intense it had physically hurt. A light knock on the door broke his reverie. A woman he hadn't seen before entered, carrying a tablet and wearing an ID badge that identified her as Pamela Walker, Child Protective Services. Mr. Mercer, I'm Pam from CPS. Do you have a moment to talk? David nodded, careful not to disturb Thomas. Pam pulled up a small stool and sat facing him. First, I want to thank you for what you did today. Not everyone would have responded so quickly or compassionately. Anyone would have done the same, David said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. You'd be surprised, Pam replied, with a hint of weariness that suggested she'd seen too many cases where that wasn't the case. She glanced at her tablet. I've been briefed on the situation. We're initiating the standard protocols for abandoned infants, including a search for the mother. Given the condition of the baby, we're hopeful she may be located and receive the help she needs." David nodded again. He'd been a teacher long enough to know that desperate situations drove people to desperate actions. "In the meantime," Pam continued, "baby Thomas will need temporary placement. We're contacting our emergency foster families now, but frankly, we're experiencing a shortage of available homes, especially for infants." Something stirred in David's mind, a half-formed thought he wasn't ready to examine directly. "How long will it take to find a placement?" he asked. "Hopefully by tomorrow afternoon, but it could be longer. We might need to place him in a group home temporarily, though we try to avoid that for newborns." Pam's professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing her frustration with the situation. "The system is overwhelmed right now." Thomas made a small sound in his sleep, and David automatically began rocking the chair gently. The motion felt familiar, like his body remembered what to do even after 17 years. "I work with teenagers," he said slowly. "As a high school English teacher, I've had some contact with the foster system through my students." Pam's expression brightened slightly. "So you understand the challenges. That's helpful." David took a deep breath. The thought that had been hovering at the edges of his consciousness suddenly came into focus with startling clarity. What would it take for me to become an emergency foster placement for Thomas? The words hung in the air between them. David was as surprised by them as Pam appeared to be. "You're interested in fostering him?" she asked carefully. I think I am," David said, the idea becoming more solid as he spoke it aloud, "at least until a more permanent solution is found." Pam studied him thoughtfully. "It's not unheard of for the finder of an abandoned child to become the foster parent, but it's unusual. There's an expedited process for emergency placements, but you'd still need to complete background checks, home inspection, and basic foster parent training. How long would that take?" "For emergency certification? A few days if we push it through. You'd need to demonstrate that you can provide a safe environment and meet his basic needs." She hesitated. "Mr. Mercer, while I appreciate your willingness to help, I have to ask, is this decision being influenced by the loss of your son?" The question stung, but David recognized its legitimacy. Was he trying to replace Alex? Was this some misguided attempt to fill the hole in his life? "I've thought about that," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "I've been thinking about it since I found him. And yes, finding him at Alex's grave feels significant. I can't explain it, but I'm not confused about who Thomas is. He's not Alex. He's a baby who needs someone right now. And for whatever reason, I was the one who found him." Pam nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "I'll need to conduct a preliminary interview and start the paperwork immediately if you're serious." "I am," David said, the certainty growing stronger. "But I'd like to talk to my ex-wife first. She's here at the hospital." "Of course," Pam said, standing. "I'll give you some time to discuss it. I'll be at the nurse's station when you're ready." After she left, David sat with Thomas for several more minutes, thinking. Was he crazy for even considering this? His life was ordered, predictable, by design. After Alex died, he'd constructed routines that allowed him to function, to keep teaching, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. A baby would shatter all of that. Another knock. Softer this time. Beth peeked in, her expression questioning. "Everything." "Okay," she asked. "Can you come in? I need to talk to you about something." Beth entered, pulling up the stool Pam had vacated. Her eyes went immediately to Thomas, a soft smile touching her lips. "He's sleeping so peacefully." "Beth," David said, his voice low, "I'm thinking about applying to be Thomas's emergency foster parent." Her eyes widened, but to his surprise, she didn't immediately dismiss the idea as crazy. Instead, she asked, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "It's a huge responsibility. I know it sounds sudden, maybe even reckless, but something about finding him there at that specific place." David struggled to articulate the feeling. "It feels like I'm supposed to do this." Beth was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Then she reached out and touched Thomas's tiny hand. "I understand," she said finally. "After Alex died, I kept looking for signs, for some meaning in what happened. Maybe this is yours." Relief washed over David. She got it. Of course she did. She was the only other person who truly understood the depth of his loss. The CPS worker said they're short. On foster homes, he continued. Thomas might end up in a group facility otherwise. Beth frowned. That's not right. Not for a newborn. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you even have anything for a baby at your house? A crib? Bottles?" "No," David admitted. "I'd have to get everything." "I still have some of Alex's baby things in storage," Beth said, surprising him. "The bassinet, at least, some blankets. I never could bring myself to donate them." David felt a lump form in his throat. They'd packed away all those items together after Alex outgrew them, laughing about maybe using them again someday for a second child that never came. "Would you be okay with that?" he asked. "Using them for Thomas?" Beth nodded, her eyes bright, with unshed tears. "Alex would like it, I think. He always had such a big heart." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, both lost in memories of their son. Then Beth straightened her shoulders, a determined look crossing her face. "If you're going to do this, you'll need help. My sister's kids are in middle school. Now I can borrow their old baby monitor, high chair, all that stuff, and I can help you set everything up." "Beth, you don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted. "I haven't felt useful, really useful, in a long time. Let me do this." David looked from her resolved face to the sleeping baby in his arms. For the first time since Alex's death, he felt a spark of something that might have been hope. Not happiness. Not yet, but the possibility of it, like seeing a distant light while lost in darkness. "Okay," he said. "Let's talk to CPS together." Beth nodded, then reached for her purse. "I'll call my sister right now, and we should make a list of everything you'll need." She paused, studying David with Thomas. "You look natural with him, you..." "No. You always were good with babies." As Beth stepped out to make her call, David looked down at Thomas, who had opened his eyes and was gazing up with that unfocused newborn stare. "What do you think, little guy?" he whispered. "Are we making the right call here?" Thomas yawned, his tiny face scrunching up before relaxing again. It wasn't an answer, but somehow it felt like one anyway. 3 days after finding Thomas at the cemetery, David stood in the middle of his transformed living room, surrounded by baby supplies. Alex's old bassinet, freshly cleaned and fitted with new sheets, sat near the couch. A changing table that Beth's sister had loaned them was set up against the wall. Diapers, wipes, formula, and bottles covered every surface. The house that had been so neat and orderly for years now looked like a baby supply store had exploded inside it. "I think that's the last of it," Beth said, setting down a bag of newborn clothes. She pushed her hair back from her forehead, leaving a smudge of dust. They'd spent the entire day retrieving items from storage, borrowing what they could and rushing to buy what they couldn't. "It's so much stuff," David said, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. "How does something so small need so many things?" Beth laughed, the sound surprising both of them. It had been a long time since laughter had filled this house. "You should have seen our apartment when Alex was born. We could barely walk without tripping over something." The memory hung between them, bittersweet but somehow less painful than usual, perhaps because they were too exhausted to feel the full weight of it, or perhaps because the present moment was too urgent to allow dwelling in the past. "Do you think we're forgetting anything?" David asked, surveying the room. "Probably," Beth admitted. "But we've got the essentials. Everything else we can figure out as we go." As she spoke, David's phone rang. He fumbled it out of his pocket, recognizing the number of the CPS worker. "Hello?" "Yes, this is David Mercer." Beth watched his face as he listened, her own expression a mixture of hope and worry. They'd spent the last 3 days in a whirlwind of activity: interviews with social workers, a rushed home inspection, expedited background checks, and a crash course in infant care. The process that normally took weeks or months had been compressed into days, partly due to the shortage of available placements and partly due to Pam's determination to make this work. "Yes," David said into the phone. "Yes, I understand. Yes, that's fine. Thank you. We'll be ready." He hung up, his hand shaking slightly. "They're bringing Thomas here tomorrow morning. The emergency foster placement was approved." Beth broke into a smile, crossing the room to squeeze his arm. "That's wonderful news." "It's really happening," David said, the reality suddenly hitting him. "I'm going to be responsible for a baby. What if I mess this up?" "You won't," Beth said firmly. "And you're not alone in this. I promised I'd help, remember?" David nodded gratefully. Beth had been a constant presence these past few days, taking time off from her job at the music store to help prepare his house. They hadn't spent this much time together since before the divorce. It was strange how easily they'd fallen back into a rhythm of working as a team, even with the underlying sadness that would always connect them. "I should probably get some sleep while I still can," David said, attempting a weak joke. Beth nodded. "Good idea. Do you want me to be here when they bring him?" "If you can," David said. "That would help." After Beth left, David wandered through his house, checking and rechecking everything. The bassinet was positioned perfectly beside his bed. The baby monitor was tested and working. The refrigerator was stocked with ready-made formula. Everything was as prepared as it could be, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of impending chaos. Paused in front of the closed door to what had once been Alex's room. They hadn't touched it or discussed it. Some boundaries remained, even in this strange new partnership they were building. Sleep that night was fitful, filled with dreams of crying babies and lost children. David woke before dawn, his mind racing with last-minute worries and to-do lists. By the time Beth arrived at 8, he'd already been up for hours, making coffee and pacing. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, setting down a bag of fresh bagels. "Thanks," David replied dryly. "I've been awake since 4. Nervous?" "Terrified," he admitted. Beth squeezed his shoulder. "That's normal. I remember bringing Alex home from the hospital. I was convinced we were going to break him somehow." "But we didn't," David said softly. "No, we didn't. We figured it out. And you'll figure this out too." The doorbell rang at precisely 9 o'clock. David took a deep breath before answering it. Pam stood on the porch, a baby carrier in one hand and a folder of paperwork in the other. Behind her, a younger social worker carried a diaper bag. "Good morning," Pam said, her professional demeanor softened by a genuine smile. "Someone's ready to see his new home." Thomas was awake in the carrier, blinking up at the world with curious blue eyes. He'd grown noticeably in just a few days, his face less red and scrunched, his movements more deliberate. "Come in," David said, stepping back to let them enter. "This is Beth, my ex-wife. She's been helping me get everything ready." "Wonderful," Pam said, nodding at Beth. "Support systems are crucial in these situations." The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork, instructions, and advice. David signed form after form while trying to absorb everything Pam was telling him about feeding schedules, doctor appointments, and CPS check-ins. Through it all, Thomas remained surprisingly calm, seemingly content to observe his new surroundings. From the safety of his carrier. "Remember, this is temporary emergency placement," Pam reminded them as she prepared to leave. "We're still searching for Thomas's birth mother. If she's found and deemed able to care for him, reunification would be the goal." David nodded, though the thought sent an unexpected pang through his chest. He'd known from the beginning this might be short-term, but already he felt connected to the tiny person who was now his responsibility. "I understand," he said. "In the meantime," Pam continued, "you have my number. Call any time, day or night, if you have questions or concerns. The first few days are always the hardest." After the social workers left, David and Beth stood looking at Thomas, who had finally dozed off in his carrier. "So," Beth said, breaking the silence. "What now?" "I guess we let him sleep while we can," David replied. and maybe eat something, ourselves. They moved to the kitchen, keeping the carrier where they could see it. Beth sliced bagels while David poured fresh coffee. The ordinary actions felt strangely weighted, as if they were playing house in someone else's life. I took the rest of the week off, David said, spreading cream cheese on his bagel. The principal was surprisingly understanding once I explained the situation. People want to help, Beth said. You should let them. You can't do this entirely alone. I'm not alone, David said, meeting her eyes. I have you. Beth smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in it. Yes, you do. But you'll need more than just me. What about your neighbors, friends from work? You'll need a support network. David hadn't thought that far ahead. The past few days had been focused solely on getting approved and prepared for Thomas's arrival. The reality of balancing a baby and his job, his life, was only now beginning to sink in. One day at a time, he said, echoing the mantra that had gotten him through the worst days after Alex's death. Beth nodded. One day at a time, a small cry from the living room interrupted their breakfast. Thomas was awake, his face scrunching up with increasing displeasure. And so it begins, Beth said with a wry smile. The rest of the day passed in a chaotic blur of feedings, diaper changes, and brief periods of blessed sleep. For Thomas, not for David. Beth stayed until evening, showing David how to warm bottles, properly how to burp the baby, how to swaddle him tightly enough to make him feel secure. You're a natural, she said as David successfully got Thomas to settle after his 6 o'clock feeding. I'm just remembering, David replied quietly. It's like riding a bike, I guess. Some things your body doesn't forget. When Beth left around 8, promising to return in the morning, David felt a momentary panic. He was alone with Thomas now. Really alone. Just you and me, buddy, he said softly to the baby nestled against his chest. Thomas blinked up at him, his tiny hand grabbing at David's shirt. The gesture, so simple and instinctual, made something tighten in David's throat. The night was long. Thomas woke every 3 hours like clockwork, hungry and increasingly vocal about it. By dawn, David was moving on autopilot, heating bottles with one hand while cradling the crying baby with the other. His eyes burned with exhaustion. His back ached from hours spent rocking and pacing. Yet there was something strangely peaceful about the rhythm of it. The world had narrowed to this small person and his needs, simple and immediate. No room for dwelling on grief or loss, no time for regrets or what-ifs. Just the next feeding, the next diaper change, the next moment of quiet connection in the blue light of early morning. When Beth arrived at 9, she found David in the rocking chair, Thomas asleep on his chest. The house was a disaster. Dirty, bottles in the sink, used diapers piled by the changing table, blankets and burp cloths strewn across every surface. Rough night? She asked, keeping her voice low. David looked up, exhaustion etched into his face. The roughest, but also not bad somehow. Beth smiled, understanding in her eyes. That's parenthood in a nutshell, the hardest thing you'll ever love doing. As she took Thomas so David could shower, she added casually, My sister wants to know if you'd like her to set up a meal train. She knows some people from the PTA who'd be happy to help. David's first instinct was to refuse. He'd grown used to handling everything himself these past 3 years, reluctant to accept help or pity, but the bone-deep exhaustion made him reconsider. That would be really helpful, actually. Thank you. One day at a time, he reminded himself as the hot water washed over him. One feeding, one diaper, one small victory at a time. Somehow, they would make it through. 6 months had passed since the evening David found Thomas at the cemetery. Half a year of sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and a crash course in modern parenting. Half a year of unexpected joy, rediscovered purpose and healing that David hadn't known he needed. The search for Thomas's birth mother had gone cold. Despite police efforts, newspaper articles, and social media campaigns, no one had come forward. The note left with Thomas remained the only clue to his origins. A few simple words on plain paper that revealed nothing about the person who had written them. Are you nervous? Beth asked, straightening David's tie as they stood in his living room. The house looked different now. Toys scattered across the floor, baby books stacked on end tables, photos of Thomas prominently displayed alongside those of Alex. It was a home again, not just a place where David existed. Terrified, David admitted. What if the judge changes her mind? Beth shook her head firmly. She won't. You've done everything right. The home visits have all been perfect. Thomas is thriving, and you have character references from the principal, 3 fellow teachers, and your neighbor who happens to be a pediatric nurse, not to mention the support of a certain music store manager. David smiled at that. Beth had become a constant presence in their lives, stopping by nearly every day, often staying for dinner. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, not a rekindling of romance, but a deep friendship built on shared history and new purpose. I just keep waiting for something to go wrong, David said quietly. For someone to realize I'm not qualified for this. That's the secret of parenthood, Beth replied, brushing lint from his shoulder. None of us are qualified. We're all just doing our best and hoping it's enough. From the nursery, the small home office that David had converted with Beth's help, came the sound of Thomas babbling happily. Amy, Beth's sister, was watching him while they went to court. We should go, David said, checking his watch. I don't want to be late. The drive to the courthouse was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. 6 months ago, David had been just surviving, moving through each day on autopilot. Now his life was chaotic, exhausting, and more meaningful than he'd ever expected it to be again. The courthouse was busy that morning, families streaming in and out of various courtrooms. David and Beth found their way to the designated family court, where Pam was waiting for them outside the doors. Good morning, she greeted them, professional as always, but with a warmth that had developed over months of home visits. Everything's in order. Judge Wilson has reviewed all the documentation and the recommendation from CPS. This should be straightforward. Nothing about this has been straightforward, David said with a nervous laugh. Pam smiled. True, but in the best possible way. Thomas couldn't have found a better father if he'd tried. Father. The word still caught David off guard sometimes. He'd been dad once before, and part of him had believed he would never be called that again. The first time Thomas had babbled something that sounded like Dada, David had wept, torn, between joy and guilt. Joy for this new bond, guilt for feeling joy when Alex was gone. The courtroom was smaller than David had expected, warm wood paneling and soft lighting making it feel less intimidating than the courtrooms on TV. Only a few other people were present, a court reporter, a clerk, and another family waiting their turn. Judge Wilson entered, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Good morning. We're here for case number 2478, the adoption petition for Thomas Mercer. The proceedings moved quickly, much of it legal formalities that David had been prepared for. He answered the judge's questions clearly, his teacher's voice steady even, as his hands trembled slightly. Mr. Mercer, Judge Wilson said, looking at him over her reading glasses, you came to foster parenthood under unusual circumstances. Finding an abandoned infant is rare, and choosing to become that child's foster parent and now adoptive parent is even rarer. What motivated that decision? David had anticipated this question, had rehearsed answers that sounded responsible and thoughtful. But sitting there, he found himself speaking from the heart instead. My son Alex died 3 years ago, he said quietly. He was 17. After that, I was just existing, going through the motions. Then I found Thomas at my son's grave of all places. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm not a religious person, Your Honor, but finding him there felt significant, like I was being trusted with something important. The more time I spent with him, the more I realized that we needed each other. He needed a father, and I needed to be one again. Judge Wilson nodded, her expression thoughtful. And you understand that this is a lifetime commitment? That regardless of how Thomas came into your life, once this adoption is finalized, he is legally your son in every way? Yes, Your Honor, David said firmly. That's exactly what I want. Very well. Judge Wilson reviewed the papers before her one more time, then looked up with a smile. Having reviewed all the documentation and recommendations, I find that this adoption is in the best interest of the child. The petition is granted. Congratulations, Mr. Mercer. Thomas is legally your son. She banged her gavel, the sound echoing, in the small courtroom. We'll take a brief recess for photos if you'd like, and then I'll need you to sign the final paperwork. Beth squeezed David's arm, tears streaming down her face. Congratulations, she whispered. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of paperwork, congratulations, and a small celebration in the courthouse hallway where Pam presented them with a gift basket from the CPS office. By the time they left, David was clutching a folder of official documents declaring Thomas legally his son. How does it feel? Beth asked as they walked to the car. David considered the question. Real, he said finally. For months I've been waiting for someone to come take him away. Now he's really mine. He always was, Beth said softly. From the moment you found him. When they arrived home, Amy met them at the door, Thomas in her arms. The baby, no longer a newborn but a chubby, active 6-month-old, reached for David immediately, his face lighting up with recognition. There's my boy, David said, taking Thomas and holding him close. Guess what? It's official now. You're stuck with me. Thomas responded by grabbing David's tie and trying to put it in his mouth, making all the adults laugh. Later that afternoon, after Amy had left and Beth was helping prepare dinner, David made a decision. I want to take Thomas to see Alex, he said. Would you come with us? Beth looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, surprise and understanding crossing her face. Of course. The cemetery was peaceful in the late afternoon light, the October air crisp but not cold. David carried Thomas, who was alert and curious, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with wide eyes. Beth walked beside them, her hand occasionally brushing David's arm in silent support. They stopped at Alex's grave, the headstone familiar and well-tended. David had continued his weekly visits, though now they often included Thomas, a diaper bag, and sometimes Beth. Hey, buddy, David said, his voice steady. I wanted you to be the first to know. It's official. Thomas is part of our family now. He glanced at Beth, including her in that statement. She smiled, eyes glistening. I brought something, David continued, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small model airplane, identical to the one he'd left the night he found Thomas. I thought maybe we could start a new tradition. He placed the plane against the headstone just as he had done countless times before. But this time Thomas reached out from his arms, small fingers grabbing at the toy. That's your brother's, David explained gently, letting Thomas touch the plane but keeping it in place. You'll have your own someday. They stood there together, the three of them, as the sun began to set. David felt a sense of peace wash over him, different from the numb acceptance he'd cultivated after Alex's death. This was true peace, the kind that acknowledged pain but wasn't defined by it. Ready to go home? Beth asked after a while. David nodded, shifting Thomas to his other arm. Yeah, it's almost his bedtime. As they walked back to the car, Thomas's head growing heavy against his shoulder, David thought about the strange path that had led him here. From devastating loss to unexpected joy, from isolation to connection. The weight of grief would always be with him. Alex would always be his son, always be loved and missed. But now that weight was balanced by something else. The warm, solid presence of the child in his arms and the woman walking beside him. What are you thinking about? Beth asked, noticing his expression. Life, David said simply. How it surprises you. Thomas stirred against his shoulder, making the small sighing sound that meant he was falling asleep.